Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on combating cyber attacks in 2022. We've got a great webinar prepared for you today on some lessons we've learned in 2021 and strategies to help you better defend and secure your Active Directory moving forward. So let's get started. I'm McKenna. I work alongside the Microsoft experts here at Chaosoft. Just a couple housekeeping items to go over before we jump into the presentation. First off, you'll notice your microphones are muted, so to make sure everybody has the optimal listening experience, we do encourage you to ask any questions you may have. So depending on how you join today, either in browser or through the app, you'll see a question or chat section in your meeting dashboard. Feel free to drop your questions in there, and we'll do our best to answer them. If we run short on time today for questions, we'll reach out to you individually to follow up. This session will also be recorded, and we'll email you a link in the days following. At the end of the presentation, we'll also be sharing our contact information. So if you have any additional questions or are watching this on demand, please feel free to reach out. While you're in your meeting dashboard, also make sure to take a look at the handout section. We've included a couple additional resources there that you can download and share with your team. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump right in. I'd like to take a moment to introduce today's speaker. With us today, we have the founder of Chaosoft, Robert Boble. Bob is one of the leading experts in hybrid Active Directory management and recovery. And with more than 25 years in the Microsoft identity industry, he's gained tons of insight and best practices. So you guys are in great hands today. And on that note, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Bob.
Hey, thanks, McKenna. Appreciate it. Just a little bit of background. Yes, I am the founder and chief bottle washer here at Chaosoft. The reason we decided to start Chaosoft was that we saw a large gap in the existing tools at the time around hybrid Active Directory and hybrid management. So we really founded Chaosoft to create a sort of next generation of management, monitoring, and recovery solutions, and I'll mention that a little bit later on as well. But today we're going to talk about some of the things that we saw over the last several years around rising targeting of Active Directory, and what people are doing to prevent being a victim. Victims are often, if they're large enough in corporate size, they're often in the newspaper, or you receive a letter with free identity theft protection. Those are the worst because you know it's already happened and you're not sure how long it happened, et cetera. So there is certainly a quickly rising attack or cybersecurity attacks or cyber attacks against Active Directory, because that solution really, if you look at it, was primarily built to be an on-premise directory where you stored the keys to the kingdom for your on-premise app. So that resided in people's data centers, et cetera. And when we went cloud, that opened that up to the internet, which it really was never designed to be done. And I personally believe that's where the vast majority of issues arose, finding that those open doors, if not properly secured, watched over, can easily become a data breach. And that's pretty evident when we look at things like the Verizon data breach report that comes out every year. This just has the 3 years prior to 2021, but you'll see there's a huge increase over time from 2018 to 2020, from almost 5% if you round up, to 18% in the number of breaches that were identified. You can imagine the ones that went unidentified. Now these breaches, I think the most common type of issue people have are insider issues, whether those be employees that are upset or someone has been able to compromise credentials and get in that way, but make the changes from the inside. But certainly Active Directory attacks are on the rise and they're expensive. And you don't want to end up losing a bunch of data because you have Active Directory misconfigured, And you don't want to lose a bunch of money or time or energy should the directory be either hit with a ransomware attack, locked up, or wiped out. And finally, we're also seeing the increased sophistication of cyber attackers. The bad guys are getting better at what they do, better at sharing information with other bad guys, and finding exploits that people didn't really think were important. A lot of it's due to misconfiguration, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. The average data breach in that Verizon report wasn't really clear, but we did find an additional source for 2020 that IBM has a security data breach report, and their report showed that each of the data breaches on average cost just under $4 million. So that's quite a bit of money that's being lost. And that doesn't just mean the data that was lost, but also the time potentially the company was out, or the cost of cleanup. So I mentioned this, we're actually in a cyber war with elements that are trying to take out Active Directory. And then also there's another type of outage of Active Directory that occurs. It's much more common that in your organization, you probably see every couple of days, and we'll talk about that. It just doesn't seem that important until you really start analyzing what's going on. So here we have just a couple of the major Active Directory attacks. The one that's really funny that's missing was the first one I knew about. Well, actually, it was the first large-scale one that involved a commercial entity. That was the Target breach at Christmas time several years ago, where HVAC company came in, they gave them an account, they finished the project, the account was never cleaned up. And somebody managed to compromise that account, get access to a workstation, elevate the privileges, and then move over to their servers. They eventually got into Active Directory. All their cash registers apparently were integrated there, and they were able to then skim credit card information as it was being used to pay for your Christmas gifts. Some of these are more sophisticated than those. Some of those are less. Could be just simple flaws in things that haven't been discovered around configuration. All the way up to exploits that are found in APIs that nobody knew about. Only secret spy people knew about it, and now it's gotten out and shared publicly. So Active Directory is pretty vulnerable to taking it offline in denial of service attacks. So if you wanted to shut down a competing company, or you just want to cause somebody a lot of headaches, then ransomware attacks or wiper attacks against AD are pretty common. There are a lot of security settings. Again, those security settings were all designed in the 80s and 90s. So a lot of those things that we think about today were never thought about back then, and evolving the original legacy Active Directory has had mixed results, I have to admit. AD itself, if it's a deletion of a user or group, you can get back from that pretty quickly. There is something called authoritative restore that'll get you there. It's difficult to use and nobody really wants to use it. So third-party tools have really come on strong. There are definitely a lack of third-party tools who can recover your entire Active Directory. A lot of different companies offer object undelete, which you can kind of do with Active Directory. You don't really need a tool for that. But restoring group memberships, license configurations in Azure AD, group policies, certification policies, access policies, there's a lot there that the recycle bins or the native restores don't provide. And so that forest-wide or Active Directory wide recovery is a very difficult proposition with lots of steps. And we know about that because we joined that fray last year with kind of a novel solution, which we're going to mention towards the end. Here's what I was talking about, going internet. The old guys like me call it the internet. Now it's the cloud. This was from a survey conducted by Pulse Research for us that I had commissioned. And if you notice, the big number here is that 54% are hybrid indefinitely. And when you add up the other folks that are going cloud in the future, up to 5 years, you get about 79% of organizations today, enterprises, are hybrid. And so everybody has the same set of problems. And when you take out people who are staying on premise, and the folks that really probably didn't need on-premise Active Directory in the first place, these folks, these enterprise organizations are going to be here for quite some time. Most of the organizations or customers we talk to, they have legacy applications that can't be moved that quick, and they're so ingrained with Active Directory, they can't really get rid of it. It's still their authoritative resource. Custom applications, internal applications, apps that third-party apps that run on premise, all those still rely and may always or never get to a point where they can use an Azure Active Directory credentials. So I believe this is another 10 years before we see the vast majority of people moving to something else, whether that's Azure Active Directory on premise, if it ever happens with Azure Stack, or they come up with ways they can truly secure and maintain that on-premise to cloud situation, which a lot of people can. I mean, they're doing that today. It's just they're held back by legacy applications. So we now know, based on this study and other studies that have very similar results, that the vast majority of organizations using Active Directory at an enterprise level, mid-market or enterprise level, are all in hybrid mode. This is exactly why we founded our company, and we did this without that kind of research. We knew based on our experience what was going on. So back in 2013, we launched our company just to modernize tools to either manage hybrid mode, where you have on-premise and cloud, or just cloud only. So now that we have all this good stuff and we're going along, how do we get to a point where we can defend this stuff, right? We know it's going to happen. You got to plan for when it happens, not maybe it'll happen or if it happens. And so we really look at how our market segment is defined by Gartner and other analytics groups to sort of understand the areas that we should be looking at. And we go to customers to find out exactly if that matches, and then we go through this weird process of identifying the major areas. And so I mentioned management, change monitoring, and recovery at the very beginning. When we translate that into a little bit more modern speak or IT talk, it comes out as sort of three different things. And these are the higher level areas that we talk about when we just start to discuss our management monitoring and recovery. So if you're working with any of the analyst groups or you go to a trade show, anything like that, you're going to see these terms quite a bit. IGA is the core term. It really started out coming to the forefront with Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, when everybody suddenly had to, all the public organizations out there, publicly held companies had to prove they weren't following IT policies internally that would result in large discrepancies between their financial reporting and their actual financial state. And then we saw HIPAA, which was healthcare, and then we saw a lot of other things. And the organization I worked for at the time, we sort of built this concept of using Active Directory as an identity platform. And that's sort of merged now into what is known as identity administration. And then we're adding a term that is being used, but not very well. This is kind of new to a lot of people. It's called identity resilience. So we use IGA as what we're sort of providing from a strategic standpoint, plus R, which is the identity resilience. Identity governance simply is a centralized management of identity and access. You use policies. User provisioning, for example, is a great example because it starts with you onboarding somebody and ends with user deprovisioning, which is offboarding employees. So it's a full life cycle. Plus, then in between, you have all these management tasks you have to do, some of which can be automated or orchestrated. That probably falls under identity governance, right? So if you are in this department and you are in this location, you must be in this email distribution group or this security group, for example. And there are solutions out there that drive that based on policy. What you're allowed to access within the organization might be governed by PCI compliance, HIPAA compliance, internal policies, right? You don't want the folks that run your cafeteria in your building also having access to unannounced financial results in a public organization, right? That's not just compliance with whatever legal or regulatory requirements you have, but also it's bad business practice, right? They see we're doing great, they might want raises. You never know, stuff like that. And then we have identity administration. This is really securing control of your administration that's happening day to day, and the tasks, not just which tasks people can perform, but how those are actually performed using roles, rules, policies, just-in-time access, approvals, those types of controls around people who are making those changes, which are absolutely necessary to happen on a day-to-day basis, right? So project comes along, you need an email distribution list with a different email address. Somebody's got to go make that change. It's not going to be something you're going to feed through an automated identity system typically. And then finally, identity resilience, which is the ability for your organization to recover quickly and sustain disruption to your identity system, which is usually Active Directory in most organizations. Deleting a user prevents them from using it. So does disabling it. So you've got to monitor both of those. But those critical systems are targets of attack. And so not only securing your IAM solutions with some secure identity administration policies, but also then having a means to recover quickly should somebody get in. We are also following in our tools zero trust model, which also says assume they already have, they just may not have shown themselves yet. So we want to make sure that we look at identity resilience as an opportunity to keep our names out of the newspaper and also to avoid putting the company out of business for any extended period of time. And we're going to get into those details as well. So let's talk about the two most common threats to Active Directory, and they may not be what you think. If we boil down the types of threats out there, I'm not talking about specific ransomware attacks or denial of service attacks. What I'm looking at is just what causes Active Directory outages, and there are two main, I think, vehicles that we see to have outages. Unwanted change and cyber attacks are the two major ones. There is a third one out there, which isn't really a cyber attack. It's a data corruption. We rarely hear about that. It does happen, but the good news is what you do to prepare on a recovery for cyber attack also helps you with the data corruption issues. So you kind of get two birds with one stone there. But let's talk about unwanted change first, and then we'll talk about cyber attacks and why unwanted changes cause more outages in number. Maybe not severity, but in number versus cyber attacks. So first threat we're going to discuss are unwanted changes, typically to your identities or the groups or the data in your Active Directory. And this may be on-premise or cloud. Could be an Azure Active Directory. Oh, I had a question come in. Approximately what percentage of enterprises have faced a complete recovery or a complete outage on Active Directory? There's one number that I remember that was from another survey we commissioned, and that was about 30% of the folks that had been asked. Now these were folks that were responsible for Active Directory. These were the VP of IT or director of IT level sort of folks, not administrators, but it was approximately 30% of environments had a complete outage at one point. It was nearly 100% for folks that had smaller outages due to directory change mistakes or malicious changes. So what are these things? So unwanted changes are somebody goes in and makes an adjustment, disables an account, or other types of havoc that result in one or more users being offline, right? So why are these a problem? Well, they're costly because they happen more frequently than you'll see in an everyday outage. These are the ones that happen in everybody's environment. May happen once a year, twice a year, 10 times a year. In really large environments, it's probably monthly where something like this happens. Somebody's on the help desk and a team can't access some information that they need to do their jobs, right? So it's costly from an outage standpoint, but really only affects a fewer number of users. It often causes more expense at the security or compliance level. So auditors come in or folks on the security team find these things, and now all of a sudden, they realize that, hey, somebody got access to something, they stole the data, or we lost money because we missed a contract, we weren't able to get the contract completed or the bid completed at time, and also oftentimes it also comes back and looks kind of bad on the IT team because they're very difficult to troubleshoot. And again, these are ones that are mistakes in the directory, and we're going to talk about those. And they can be one of two things. And we've seen these changes happening by both, people getting into the directory and making changes from outside. Could be partners, could be other people that have hacked a workstation, gotten a directory account, and they use that to do just straight up reconnaissance. But then there are also people who do these things maliciously, and then there's just honest mistakes, right? And again, from another study we did, we looked at almost 50% more insider attacks over the past several years. So we definitely see something increasing there, and the cost of those is pretty severe. I don't know where they got $11.45 million. Most of the ones I see are a couple days. Most of these are mistakes, not credential thefts, but still 25% of these things are where somebody's stolen your password. And then finally, 14% again from that same study were actually insiders that, people that worked, employees or contractors that worked, and they got upset and they did something, to rename the CEO account or something crazy like that. So some of the characteristics of these mistakes or malicious changes are objects get deleted. Those can be recovered unless they do what's called a hard delete. Then you're kind of stuck. You have to rebuild them. That's a lot more difficult, and recycle bins don't do that, and Microsoft doesn't provide hard deletion recovery, so keep that in mind. More often, it's changes to group memberships, or they add licenses or grant themselves access to something they shouldn't. Or it's, they bring up a user who's supposed to get access to unannounced financial results, and they grab the wrong Jim Smith, right? And they give the wrong person. Auditor comes along, finds it. Now all of a sudden there's a SOX compliance violation. That material finding costs them, $100,000, something crazy. But there's also changes to just basic attributes and data on users or groups, what they're assigned to, et cetera. And those are much more difficult to sort of track, but they happen. Again, smaller number of users, hard to find and fix typically because they don't usually just pop up in event data. So you have to come up with some way to monitor for those. And they can be any identity system or any system that uses identity. So in our case, we're always looking at on-premise or legacy Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. And frankly, inside of Office 365, you manage Azure Active Directory user objects and group objects. And so it really extends for us to Office 365 as well. So how do you prevent that? Well, really, you got to prepare for that. And that means looking for change monitoring or change auditing software that simplifies the data coming back. And you want a backup solution, right? Because we know the recycle bins can't do anything. You probably don't want snapshot-based backups, whether those are VMs or file-based. The reason being is that between the backup times, you'll lose that type of data. Maybe somebody changes something 2 or 3 times, and you only caught the first change. That could be a problem. So then you're back to manually trying to restore those. Another thing is control your administrators and start to implement least privilege delegation. And we used to just simply call this delegated administration, but the framework around zero trust that Microsoft and others have adopted, which simply means, here are the things you need to do physically to secure your environment, and assume that somebody is already operating within the environment with privileges, and they're there to do harm, right? There's some bad actor that's in there, and it's your chance to put up barriers to them so they can't progress, and then finding them and fixing it. So we called it zero trust identity administration. And really, in the past, we would have just said adopt least privilege, but there is more than just least privilege delegation there. But that's the tenet, one of the two tenets that we're really interested in from a Chaosoft perspective, and it's one of the easier things to do. And the others, of course, limit what you're doing in terms of native permissions, use roles, implement rules, and then start to use some additional things around just-in-time access and some other things. The change monitoring and recovery, I don't believe, well, I know there's no modern Microsoft solution that meets this. Microsoft has Sentinel, their SIEM, it's all based on event data. It can do change monitoring as long as condition A, B, C are met, but it doesn't do anything to roll it back. So you have to be careful there what you're choosing. Third party is really the only way that we know to do this and protect your environment. Let's talk about what I meant by continuous change monitoring or change monitoring. Well, one of the cool things is if you're monitoring, you're getting all the changes and you have before and after values, then you have the data to roll it back, which is kind of interesting to me. But you want to monitor your directories. If you have on-premise, then you just need to worry about that. If you have hybrid, then you have 2 directories to really worry about. And if you have just Azure Active Directory or just Office, then you're really back to 1, but it's cloud-based, and there's stuff in both directories that may not be logged. That's a key problem. But you need to continuously review those, continuous change detection, look for things. Most of the time, those changes, you can then go to the event logs and see the actual events. You actually need to be reading hard changes and set up alerts to look for those things that may be most important to you. Somebody being added to a privileged group or role, global admins in the cloud, enterprise admins, domain admins on-premise, or other custom ones that you've created that grant access to applications. And the faster you can recover in situations from those by rolling those changes back or denying those changes, the better off you're going to be. It's going to be less costly, et cetera. And then there's a whole other area you should be monitoring as well, and that's just the static configuration of your directories. We have a list of things that we recommend you look at. On the cloud side, conditional access policies, one administrator makes a change, the other one doesn't know what happened, and then suddenly they're working on 2 different realities, right? One's working with the thought of how it works with the changes, the other person isn't. So even just from a communication standpoint, these changes need to be looked at and evaluated by everybody involved who's going to be managing that. Others, it's more about, hey, if this setting is wrong, people can, take out your, take control of Kerberos, something crazy like that. So admin SD holder, that is the object and Active Directory. That's basically the template permissions go through your directory to, and on all your DCs to set permissions. You have all your Azure roles, your DNS, especially if it's AD integrated, your 365 and Azure roles. We mentioned that before. Active Directory, security ACLs, caps in Azure Active Directory, application policies, authentication policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's just lots of things to look at. You want to definitely have a alert if those types of things are being changed in addition to your other privileged items that you might want to watch. So if the CEO account needs to be monitored for change because people use it as a target for voicing their concern or upsetness with the company. Upsetness, is that a word? I don't think it's a word. Their anger at the company, then maybe you should be watching those critical accounts as well, especially because they also probably have access to things that could get you issue with either security or compliance. So continuous change auditing and alerting is pretty important. It doesn't rely typically on event logs, because event logs are often one of the very first things that a bad actor will target to sort of hide their tracks, right? They're going to tamper with the logs, disable the logs, etc. So a good continuous change auditing solution should have alerting, and it should also be tied into your rollback, right? And even like an automatic rollback for specific changes. So they can't occur unless somebody approves them first, then the change can be made. But again, you don't want to necessarily just rely on a SIEM tool with logs, because the logs may not be reliable. So continuous change monitoring can actually enhance your existing SIEM tools or your auditing tools, because they'll let you see things especially in a cyber attack, that the SIEM tool may never get to, right? And then there are, again, changes that are not logged. Escalation of privilege in Azure AD is not logged, which is weird. And then there are other things that these things can do. You can use them to detect threats. And like I mentioned, they should be integrated with your recovery system, so that if you have something you know should never happen, and it happens, you can automatically roll it back, or you can very quickly analyze what's going on and roll it back on its own. Now, that integration for immediate recovery is pretty important. If you already have all the change data, and again, before and after values, being able to first of all isolate an issue. You suspect it might be a problem. Let's isolate it, see if it went further, and then from that moment, you need to reverse that so that some compromise doesn't continue, or some outage has occurred either on the sort of the attribute and object level or at the forest level. You need to be able to bring that stuff back as quickly as possible, again, for identity resilience purposes. And remember, the recycle bins are just undo delete. That's all they are. And they're not undo hard delete. So there's a bunch of stuff there. They don't get conditional access policies. They don't, the list goes on and on what they don't do. They're great if you just accidentally deleted something, but that's one command in what, 75 or something like that an administrator could do. Again, just a reminder, snapshot or file-based change auditing or change monitoring solutions may not be the best because their snapshots are typically point in time. VM snapshots, same thing, incremental snapshots. They're likely to have missed changes in between, which the thing that causes the problem could have been the item that's missed. Again, we believe only a third-party solution is going to do this. We happen to offer one, of course. That's why we do these webinars. But there are others out there that do a pretty darn good job of meeting these kinds of requirements. So the second part in controlling these unwanted changes is to adopt that zero trust identity administration model. Least privilege, I hope you've all heard about that. Somebody asked earlier, does this include least privilege, and what exactly is least privilege? Well, I guess the best way for me to describe it is, if somebody doesn't need the ability to reset passwords, don't let them. Right? If they're a help desk person and all they're doing is granting access to resources through group memberships, don't let them reset passwords. Don't let them, change email addresses. Don't let them do any of that stuff. You want to give them the minimum set of permissions, or maybe roles if you're familiar with roles. They need to get their job done. In a lot of environments in the past, we had to give people domain admins to get jobs done, because there wasn't a good delegation model inside of on-premise Active Directory, or one that was flexible enough and easy enough to maintain to really be effective. And we always used to say, eliminate your domain admins, right? You have as few as possible. Well, now you have the Azure top level admins, you have global administrators, as few of those as possible. Get rid of everybody in there except for the one or two people that really need to have those godlike permissions. Because once they're in global administrators, they literally can do anything not just in Office, but also in Azure because of this escalation of privilege issue. So just be careful there. Role-based access control is now part of what they're doing in Azure. It's an additional, what, $50 a month per user, something crazy like that. I don't remember exactly. It may not be that much. I remember it was 25 for P1, and they may have moved some stuff around, but it was pretty expensive to add. But they do have roles. Unfortunately, there's nothing back on the on-premise side to do that. But definitely manage those roles. Keep an eye on them. I would definitely be monitoring those for change, no question. And then on the AD side, you're going to watch those groups. You need to identify those as quickly as possible and then monitor those for changes. So even if it's some group you've created that's giving access to an application, you want to definitely be careful there and watch those as well. If there are just a few, you can sometimes do it with just some PowerShell scripts to dump those and do a membership count. And if they change week to week, or day to day or hour to hour, there's an issue. Or you can look at some of the monitoring tools out there. Privileged user policy. Now, this is not something that happens inside of Active Directory. It's an approach to getting your administrators into a position where they're less likely to have their credentials compromised and less likely to have issues that cause problems for your environment. So obviously, you want to continuously monitor the roles or the privileged groups or the access control lists they're added to. I suggest just-in-time assignments of permission. So don't let them be a global admin unless they request it and somebody else approves it. And then use time-based limits to make sure that they get their 5 hours in that group to do their work, and then they're automatically removed from that after some period of time. Those temporal time periods on group memberships are really important here. The other way people used to do this, and some still do it, they prefer it, is to use one normal account as a normal password, and that you use for your email and your reports and your spreadsheets. But anytime you go to do an administrative task, use a second account that holds permissions, and then the requirements for those accounts is a lot stricter. The challenge I see with that is lateral movement, which we're going to talk about next. So that's important. But in any case, that's still better than nothing. And with those secondary privileged accounts, make sure that trustee account or that account is assigned the minimum number of permissions. Use least privilege there as well. Require multi-factor now that it's with Azure and pretty much everybody can use it, whether you're on-premise or cloud. Definitely implement that. And then also for applications that are working exposed to the internet or internal applications, disable legacy authentication. It's just not strong enough anymore. Use modern authentication to make sure you have as secure a possible process for verifying user credentials. All right, preventing lateral movement. Now, with lateral movement, it's interesting. It may be a basic user account is compromised, which allows somebody to get to a workstation. And if that user has permissions, and there are several utilities out there that will, out of memory, grab credentials, they may find an administrator account and its password in memory on that machine. Once they've compromised that, they also can discover on the network and do reconnaissance. They'll now use that new credential to go compromise something else. And it doesn't have to be a global admin. It could be something similar, or simple. It could be server operator. It just gets them the next step for more reconnaissance, et cetera. So as soon as somebody gets a phishing email where they lose their password, you're suddenly in that situation where it's potentially now a dangerous situation where somebody could compromise their workstation and start this process for lateral movement. And this is, you're going to start to see, or if you haven't already, people are talking about identity-defined security. And that means it all starts with a bad user, right? And if you can secure that user, getting rid of passwords or using multi-factor or eliminating phishing, whatever it might be, that starts the process for securing everything else. If you have common administration usernames and passwords across all machines, that's one way. If they get that local administrative password, they pretty much can compromise anything. So Microsoft has this solution called local admin password, or LAPS. And what it does, it will store a randomized password in the Active Directory itself for administrative access to those workstations. It is a fat client, which kind of stinks from Microsoft, but it is free. You do have to ACL the directory, so only administrators can use the LAPS data in the directory. You don't want everybody grabbing that because it's the passwords, and you have to be able to use them. So Microsoft provides this tool, which means even if they compromise one workstation, they don't necessarily compromise the next. From a local administration password, another method people use. What we've done in our administrator solution or tool is we've created a web version of that so that you don't have to have it on every workstation. Or you don't have to go and search. You can actually delegate this out to administrators to let them use this more secure method for getting access permissions on a normal workstation. So that's free. There's a URL down there at the bottom, chaosoft.com/AD management tools. Kind of a cool solution. So I'm going to turn it over to Chad. He's going to do two very quick demos for us. One's just rolling back a single change quickly, something that might cause a user level outage from an unwanted change. And then he's going to show you what roles and rules do for zero trust administration through a delegation model. So Chad, are you there?
I am here.
All right, Chad, I just made you a presenter. So if you would do your worst, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. So the first thing I'm going to show is what happened actually recently with one of our prospect customers. This is one example of a change that was just an innocent change. A administrator ran a PowerShell script. They accidentally removed the membership to one of their groups. It cleaned it out, and like you said, it was a completely innocent thing, something that can happen and probably have us happen to a lot of us, over the years. So one of those mistakes that sometimes just happen. But in this case, it just happened to be a change that occurred to a licensing group. So they got some calls from the help desk, and several people called in and said, hey, I no longer happen to have access to email or Teams. Now, it just so happened this was a healthcare organization, so these were doctors and nurses, so frontline or first line responders. So very, very critical to get this restored as quickly as possible. It just so happened that they were in a POC with Chaosoft with our Guardian product, and what they did was they tracked down first the folks that called in the issue, and then once they did that, they determined that the change came from the original licensing change, and all they had to do to revert this was go to the original change where the group was changed. If you looked at the details, you see where all the people were removed, and with this product, you just have to go roll back, say yes, and then what that's going to do is it's going to use the data that's been gathered, in this case, all of the users that were removed from the group, and now you see that they've been restored. This was a very critical situation in that this group was manually maintained. It was not any kind of dynamic membership at all. Somebody joins the company, they get added to the group, which gives them the license. So no real record that would have helped them recover from this if they had not had this tool. So that's one very recent scenario we had, and it was a real life scenario. Another one that is kind of interesting, and Bob mentioned earlier, if you have an escalation of privilege, even if it's someone that is a global admin in Azure, something easy to do, but you probably want to make sure that you have a record if somebody goes out and escalates their privilege. So with our Guardian product, it's not only looking at on-prem AD, but also looking at changes in the cloud. Real-time alerting, notice this came through pretty quickly. And because this was one that we denote out of the box as a high level change, I got an immediate Teams alert that this occurred. Take it to the bottom of my Teams. Here we go. So here's my Teams alert, and I also got an email alert. So this not only has Teams integration, but email integration, so you can respond to these changes very quickly. And in this case, I do not want myself to be escalated, so I'm going to do that rollback again. And if I come here and refresh my property page, we will see that I am no longer elevated in my access. So not only did I get that alert, but I also got the ability to roll that back, and honestly didn't even have to go into the native tools to do so. From a delegation standpoint, least privileged. This mess on the left-hand side is what I see because I'm logged in as an administrative user. So I see all of the delegation, the virtual admin units, as we call them at Chaosoft, that I've set up to be able to control my environment. But I do not want this to be what everybody sees, so I need to set up roles and rules around what people can see and what people can do. So I have a couple users here that I have set up that I can kind of display this with. The first here is my help desk user. He is in my Columbus office. So what I've done is I've limited him to only see Columbus. He can only see users, contacts, and groups. And if we look at not only what he's available to see, I've also, with the roles that I've assigned him, limited the actions that he can take. He's allowed to create new users and go through that process. He cannot delete users, and he cannot do some of the other things that would be functional for user accounts. So based on what roles and responsibilities I've given him, he can see Columbus, he can do certain actions. I have another user that's an engineering manager type of user. Similar thing, he can see the engineering admin unit. I've given him access to users and groups. He does not have access to create new users. He can't delete users. So he's limited by what I have delegated him in his roles and responsibilities. But the cool thing with our product, since it understands the hybrid and the cloud as well, I've also added him a Teams view so he can look at his teams, look at the properties, the membership, and just a few things. So it's just a high-level example of how we can help control this through the roles and rules that you can set up. There are also other things that we can do to really enforce compliance and consistency, data integrity throughout the organization with attribute policy, which affects our web controls as well. And of course, we can go into more detail at a later date if you would like. And we'll turn it over to Bob again.
Thanks, Chad. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Hopefully you're back to seeing my screen, my slides.
Yes, sir.
Perfect. One last thing I'll mention about the roles and rules within our administration proxy. There are no native permissions granted there to use that. They're all granted within the context of our application, within our security. It's almost like a firewall around your identity directories, your Active Directory, your Azure Active Directory. And the reason that's important is if somebody gets their account compromised, there's another layer there. So they can't use the common approach they've used with everybody else, which would be go straight to the directory and start trying to exercise permissions. They have to know that we would be in the environment, and they have to overcome any kind of additional login security or application security we have. So just another thing to put in their way to prevent them from having issues if their account is compromised. And again, much more granular than any of the native permissions that are provided through roles or just bulk groups. So let's talk about the next threat. This is the large scale threat from a cyber attack. This is where your Active Directory is actually taken out. It is brought down in total, so all your users are out, and if all users are experiencing an outage because the directory is out, your entire business that operates with Active Directory at its core is going to be at a standstill. Which means, if you're a high transaction organization and those transactions are, require your Active Directory there, or answering customer calls or bidding on projects, whatever it might be, everything stops. It's just done. Those are typically ransomware attacks where they encrypt the domain controllers, or they are wiper attacks where they just kill the machines. They just blow them up. I did mention that also in these situations, we do occasionally see Active Directory corruption. I have not yet in 6 years actually spoken with a customer who has had this. That wasn't caused by some upgrade at Microsoft in the first couple of years or first couple of iterations of Active Directory doing something sort of a little more exotic. So those are a lot less possible. I do hear they happen, but they're a lot less. But again, Active Directory outages affect everybody in the organization, and it's definitely an issue. You want to secure AD, look for threats, keep the machines patched, improve the management, like we were talking about. That's the zero trust administration. And most importantly, with this type of attack, be prepared for it. It's not, if it ever happens, it's when it happens. I was speaking to the IT director for one of the bigger banks in the United States, and that's the attitude they're taking. And so they're very careful about planning the way they do their recovery strategy. So a couple of implications besides just the high cost of business. One of the problems with this is that full forest recovery or full Active Directory recovery is pretty complex. And so some of the things that contribute to the potential disaster are that you don't test it very much. But that, in it by itself, if you have a plan, that's at least a good step forward. Most people base their plan on the Microsoft recovery documentation, which doesn't provide a unified way to actually do the recovery. It's just a set of guides. And so people are left to script it themselves, which means if Active Directory, has some piece that your scripter doesn't understand, it's going to be a little tricky. And because it's scripted, testing it can be an issue, especially trying to split this between scripting and some backup utility. It can be pretty ugly. But over on the right-hand side, this is a study we just completed through a group called Pulse Research. And again, we asked, I think it was 400 and some people who are responsible for Active Directory, what were the top concerns about bringing back Active Directory after these. And the number one is not recovering quickly enough. One of the classic use case studies was Maersk. It's a global shipping company. It's one of the top ones in the world in terms of shipping companies, in terms of size. And I want to say it took them 9 days just to recover Active Directory. They had to recover everything from scratch. Most people are now down into the day or 2 or 3 day if they really work hard at maintaining that. But then you look at the rest of this study, the bigger concern was responsibilities for doing the recovery. Nobody knows who's supposed to be responsible for that. They're not sure the recovery plan they have would actually work. The backup solution, maybe they're using brick level backup, which is a traditional backup, just grab a snapshot of the server. Unfortunately, if the server is encrypted and you take a backup of that, the virus or the compromise is obviously still going to be there. And so when you boot it, it's going to go right back into the pay me now mode. And it was good to see, though, that most people have some sort of backup plan. Unfortunately, the amount of confusion here you'll see is pretty startling. So we think that once a month is probably enough. Maybe every 2 weeks to test a backup is probably a better choice, given all the things that can go wrong. Your existing backup tools, your Commvaults, your Veeams, whatever they are, they're not going to be a lot of help here because in order to have a full recovery from a ransomware attack, you really need to bring back the identities first. And so, they are often just full backups of what you have going on. If you're lucky, you do have backups of your domain controllers, and if you're smart enough, you might be able to get through it pretty quickly. But bare metal backups will reintroduce typically whatever hazard that took the directory out in the first place. Data recovery is pretty worthless if you don't have user accounts that can access it. And in an environment of any size, you can imagine how long it would take to give people back access. If they have brand new user accounts, you have to reassign access everywhere. And nobody is really running a lot of reports that I know of showing who has access to what because of the scale of the problem. So Active Directory Forest recovery solutions definitely enhance backup and recovery when traditional backup and recovery tools because they let you bring back the directory first, and then you can bring back your folders and applications and all those secondary things. But you get your people back to work by getting them to log in first, and then once you have them logging in, you can branch out to other things. Chad, who just did the previous demo, actually has had that good fortune of going through that process unaided, and so he knows the fear that grips you when you realize what's happened. So how hard can it be? Well, if you're going to follow Microsoft's prescriptive guidance, these are just some of the things that have to be done. But this is costly, time-consuming, takes a lot of pre-planning. You really have to have an expert. That may also be pretty expensive to keep on staff. And then, there's no scripts or anything provided with the Microsoft solution. So to automate this, you either have to have a very extensive playbook to follow, or you have to try and script it. Much easier to go out and find a third-party tool like our Guardian tool. But there are a lot of steps here that are pretty intimate in terms of knowledge of Active Directory. I think people could get through it. It's just quite complex and time-consuming, and if your entire company's down, time is of the essence because time is ultimately equivalent to money in these situations. I definitely wanted to mention Microsoft's Active Directory Forest Recovery Guide. These can take multiple days or weeks or months if you're not good at pre-planning all of this stuff. Most of the time, it's a couple of days, right? So companies completely shut down for a couple of days. Part of our study was also, could you survive that? And most of the people said yes. I think there was a small percentage that that said no, they likely wouldn't survive it. Whether they meant they would be fired, the company would continue, or the company go out, I don't know. But this is a good little reference to understand the complexity and what needs to actually happen in the steps. You really want to try for recovery within an hour or less. We strive for immediate recovery with our solution from both unwanted change, which you just saw. As soon as he found the change, he clicked undo, and we also could have automated that. And then from Cyberattacks, we really want you to recover identity first, and then start to recover the applications and data secondary, so that people can get access to it as the rest of it becomes online. And remember, your additional solutions can benefit. Your original backup solution can benefit because they likely are going to reintroduce infection. Microsoft won't help, so you're stuck unless they have some kind of strange service contract with Microsoft Services. You're not going to get much out of them. Now we're going to attempt something here. I'm going to ask Chad. I'm going to go ahead and give Chad control, and I would like him as quickly as possible to show you how we did a full forest recovery in a matter of minutes, which is what we call immediate recovery.
Cool, thanks, Bob. So I, just given the time of the time we have today, I went ahead and ran this earlier, and I do want to show you the history of everything that occurred, so you can kind of see the details of the whole thing. So I ran a backup. So I have 4 domain controllers, 2 forests that I'm backing up with this. Backing up all 4. The job was pretty quick, just under 2 minutes or so. I immediately then went and deployed a recovery site in Azure, which is one of the nice features that we have with the product. So if you have an Azure environment, it's literally a one-click button to do an Azure recovery site that I'll show you here in a moment. That took about 3 minutes to create the VMs and set up the networking. And then I did the verification of that process, and then finally did the actual recovery, which took about 13 minutes. That process, I can show you the details of. But out of the 4 domain controllers, I set up the restore to actually only restore 2 of those domain controllers and clean up the metadata for the other ones I did not restore, because I'm doing this right now just for the purpose of verifying that everything restored appropriately, that my AD is there, my group policy is there, and everything that I would expect is there and functional. In most scenarios, you're not going to restore every single Active Directory domain controller in the environment. You're going to restore the bare necessities and build those out afterward, and which is the way that I did that at my ex company, actually, but of course the hard way, not 3 or 4 button clicks. We had to do it the old-fashioned way. But this list that I'm scrolling down should look pretty familiar. It's basically almost a one-for-one from what Microsoft recommends. So we are utilizing the best practice and recommendations for Microsoft. So our restoration process is fully supported. In Azure, go to my resource groups. I have the one-click resource recovery site that was created. So here's my 2D VMs that were created from this, and I've actually going to take a chance here. I haven't logged into either of these yet. So let's see what happens. So we'll copy the public IP address. Open up an RDP session.
While he's logging in, one of the huge benefits of us automatically generating a recovery site is that it's isolated from your production network, so the machine names don't conflict. So even if you wanted to leave your existing corrupted, ransomware infested machines online for forensic analysis later, you can bring up this Azure recovery site and you don't have to really do anything in your production. It just does it with a button. And this is why we call it immediate.
Yep, that is correct. Oh, and one extra thing I kind of added to prove out group policy when I did the restore. And you guys can see that this is my first time logging in because I get all the prompts that I hate. But I set the special background, just pick something random that Microsoft provides. But yep, that proves my group policy is there. My Active Directory users computers should prove my domain has existed. And here's the group information, and like, awesome. Here's the group I looked at earlier. So here's all my groups and everything, just exactly as I would expect it. So everything from an AD standpoint, with none of the nonsense that comes from the virus or
That's
ransomware.
Awesome. That's awesome. And this is so easy. You could test this literally daily. Chad does these demos daily, so we know we can do these things daily.
Yes.
Again, probably overkill in these environments, but certainly you eliminate that need, to rely on scripts. Be concerned that your recovery is not going to work, because you can test it now and prove it out and try it and all that good stuff without damaging your production and without having to do a lot of work, actually.
Correct.
So
and the beautiful thing is, when I decide I no longer want this and I'm ready to test again, I'll just delete my recovery site right here from Guardian. It's going to take care of the entire site and all of the resources that are linked. So my cleanup is complete, and I never had to do a thing but a few button clicks here in Guardian.
So one click creation of the Azure recovery site for your Azure Active, or for your on-premise Active Directory, and 2 clicks to remove it. 1 click to delete it and 1 click to confirm it. That's great.
Yep.
So, Chad, that was awesome.
Yep,
he's on the recovery plans. The part of the process we just don't have time to go through. It's really not necessary once you see how the backup and recovery works, or it actually works. We do have separate backup plans, so you can kind of design a backup to use for testing. One that may just be designed for DR on domain controllers alone, one for Forest A, one for Forest B, whatever your backup strategies are. You can have multiple backup plans, and then also multiple backup recovery plans as well. So you can figure out which one is best for you depending on the type of catastrophe you had. By the way, this is inclusive of the unwanted change recovery as well. We are the only solution in this case that gives you one platform for change auditing and monitoring, object and attribute level recovery, and then full forest recovery. The leading competitor in the space, I shouldn't say they're leading, they're the most volume that they've had. They've been around for 20 years or so. I think to do all this plus the hybrid stuff, it's 7 or 8 products that we would replace with one. So pretty good deal. Thanks, Chad, for that. Let's get ready to close up. Appreciate it. So
No
I'm gonna
problem.
go ahead and reshare my desktop here. Kazam. So we're going to spend a couple seconds just talking about what we do. Again, I mentioned management, monitoring, and recovery. This is for on-premise directory, Active Directory, on-premise Exchange, Azure Active Directory, Exchange Online, Teams. We provide automatic user provisioning and deprovisioning. We have license optimization and simplified management with quotas and license profiles. We are simply the most advanced company dealing with modern Microsoft enterprise management today. And again, I mentioned 9-to-1 or 7-to-1 tool replacement. Other competitors in the space that are in management, it's usually 2 or 3-to-1. That just happens to be a exceptional replacement ratio we have for that other vendor. If you're more interested in that, please ask us. There are a lot of companies that trust us, both from the commercial organizations in the government and educational. I wanted to just hit a couple things here. We use a single unified approach for hybrid management. So all of our tools manage your on-premise and cloud. We don't, force you to have one on-premise and one on, for the cloud, and then rig up some strange configuration to make them work together. Our targets are to improve your security, compliance, and IT efficiency. And underneath compliance, we're really talking about, availability of your organization. Last thing, we have a 5 out of 5 on our support ratings over the last several years. And we have a 99.7, I think, customer retention rate over a 5-year period. So when we obtain a customer, we make them happy. It is subscription based, so we realize we need to earn your trust every day. So I'm hoping, what you've seen will encourage you to investigate a little bit more. If not, that's great. If we can answer any questions addition to this that we did not get to, we will by email. So hang in there. With that, I'm going to turn it over to McKenna and let her close up the session.
Thanks, Bob. And Chad, thank you so much. Great presentation, very informative, great demos. Everyone, that concludes our presentation today. We hope you enjoyed, and we'd like to thank everyone for their time. If you have any additional questions, like Bob said, feel free to reach out to us, and that contact information is listed at the top right of your screen. We also have 2 additional links on the screen for you, quick links that we get questions for all the time. Our /demo to get set up a personalized demo with one of our experts here. Or if you'd like to get a quote, that /quote will take you right there and see how we compare on pricing. And of course, for more information about our products and solutions in general, feel free to visit our website, chaosoft.com. Again, thank you so much for your time, and we hope you all have a great day.